Thank you all know me. I'm Ms. Paredes. I'm the EL coordinator slash math teacher slash EL coordinator, that order. So the activity that I'm going to walk you through, we as an EL department, so Ms. Carville, I'm sorry you have to go through this again, have done this already, and this is something that we did it in a 50-minute period, and we still didn't have enough time, but I think that it's something that I wanted to share, and it's something that I wanted to open to you and your departments, and the sense of if you want to continue to explore this, then I would be happy to be a part of one of your department meetings or one of your TCT meetings to continue to explore this idea. So I'm going to take us back to a previous presentation that I was also a part of, which was around accommodations and modifications through MTSS. And one of the quotes that we posted up there when we went through this is that no matter what explains the students' lack of learning, schools can and must commit to a collective responsibility to provide and serve supports. And this includes not only the DL or EL teachers, this would include all general education teachers in the school. So I know that it's easier to say, let's accommodate than it is to actually accommodate, not having a structure as to where am I starting with this task and then how am I going to accommodate it, or to what level do I have to accommodate this to. So this is another thing that we just posted up in our previous MTSS presentation, is the fact that we're accommodating because of the different cultural backgrounds, the linguistic backgrounds, and then the academic backgrounds that students are coming to, amongst other diversities. And then Ms. Lackey is going to start passing out some rubrics, and that's where we're going to start our conversation today. While she's doing that, I just want to point out very briefly the differences between accommodations and modifications. An accommodation, like we have previously stated, is something that that does not change what the student is expected to learn. So you're not changing the content. Maybe you're changing how the student is accessing that content. And a modification changes the content being taught and what the student is expected to learn. So maybe you might shorten the number of questions that a student is actually responsible for on a test. Maybe you might shorten the reading and the main ideas that the student has to actually learn for that specific unit. So when I was preparing for a meeting with my department and looking at readings and kind of thinking of like students coming to tutoring and often having a reading, or not often, but sometimes having readings in front of them that are not at their level of comprehension, like I could see that. I could see that students were having a challenging time, and I'm not just talking about EL students. I think that this is in all students. Many students can struggle with the reading depending on whether it's within a comprehension level that is appropriate for them. So what I thought was lacking was how can I rate this reading in terms of whether it's accessible for my students or not. So I took, and this is for myself to use when I'm considering what I'm going to provide and put in front of my students. So I took two rubrics which are created by WIDA, which is what we use as the EL, like our students take the access which comes from WIDA. It's a big part of the EL department. And then I created something, we like to sonify things. I created something that I thought I could actually use. So if you look at the rubric, it has the first column here has a level 1 and level 2 students. A level 1 and level 2 students are students that are coming into the country, have no English, and this can really range. They have either no English or they might be able to, so they've been here maybe a year or two. So these would be like our ESL 1 and ESL 2 students. Some of you might not understand what that means, but if you understand Lexile scores, the students at the ESL 2 level are about a Lexile score of 350 or 400. That's a grade level of like 3rd to 4th grade, according to the data that I pulled from the reading assessment program that we purchased this year. The level 3 and 4, I think Ms. Lackey and I would agree this would be around a 5th to 6th grade level, and then the level 5 would be then 7th to 8th, and then if students reach a level 6, that means that they are on level with a student that is native to the country or a native speaker grade level. So I took a look at this, and we looked at for processing language, reading and listening, because that's something that when we're giving instructions, our students understanding what they're listening to. We look at the linguistic complexity, and we look at the sentence dimension, and then we also look at the word and phrase level. And we look at whether our readings, or I was looking at whether the readings that my students were presented with were appropriate for them. So I'm going to hand you a biology. Ms. Lecky is going to start passing out a reading from a biology class. And while she's doing that, I'll talk a little bit about why I created the rubric. So the rubric here is not intended for assessing students, but instead it's intended for assessing our tasks, and like I said before, what we're putting in front of our students. If a task is not within their reach, then we are not assessing our students and what they're capable of doing, and instead we're assessing their inability to actually access the content that we're placing in front of them. And also this was intended as a guidance for teachers, and by teachers I meant me, because I created this tool, but I don't think that it's the only tool that we can create to determine which students our assignments, readings, and instruction are most appropriate for. So you have now the rubric in front of you, and I know that I just handed these two to you, and so it might be a little bit, we actually took a lot more time during our previous meeting, but I'd like you to take a look and reflect using the rubric that I just handed you, and using the reading. Maybe take a minute, let's take 2 minutes to think and talk at your tables, and determine where do you think this reading would fall under. Would it fall under the level 1 and 2, the middle, or kind of like the higher level? And I know that you're not going to have time to read this entire article, but feel free to start discussing at your tables what you think, even just with that first section, what you think or where you think this article would fall.
Technical abstract.
I think it's 5 because of the linguistic jargon that's necessary.
Spontaneous generation. Yeah, what do you like in here?
But it's like providing, but it's shorter. It's giving the jargon, but also providing the necessarily
The
basic.
ideas within the so like it's just instead of
Other
underlining
than if you do that, like,
the visual way and then the flash at the beginning, that's like the beginning. Right, that's just how I annotate them quickly. Usually I write.
yeah, some compound, complex, and right. So probably 5, 4 or 5. Can we go halvesies?
Understanding what like all that kind of stuff.
And when they're providing the definitions of the words within the content of the paragraph.
But I think it's because
But the middle one has like idioms and multiple meanings across content areas.
but also like this in the 1600s, like that's extraneous information that's not necessarily like pared down. So I think like in language learner, like
They only need to bear them.
right. I feel like adding extra details in here for like a upper middle school reading, essentially. That's why I think it would be 4 leaning more towards the 5. But see, on the surface it looks good because it's chunked
And
nicely.
it's got words that are underlined and it makes you see.
Underlined and then like described right after. Like all the like vocabulary words are described. Well, they don't describe spontaneous generation. They don't describe hypothesis.
Do they know it's maybe I'm wrong.
And also need to see in
Are each one of these different?
lessons. Is this the first time the students encounter this?
Yeah, they don't know.
That's an issue that you need to know in the scope of the lesson themselves. Is that the first time? So they might have been covering generalization there.
Because I also think that last line when it's talking about it's just lifting off on a bunch of ologies just to make it like.
So, as you were going through this, as you were reading it, and I think that part of this, and like what I intended this rubric to be is, or I'm not going to call it, this tool was for us to reflect on our work and how we are providing access to our students. So as you're looking at this tool and as you're looking at the reading, in your groups, where did you feel like this reading was falling?
Our group said 4, moving towards a 5 because of specifically the content area language, especially throughout it, and having the prior background knowledge of like what the scientific method is and knowing some of the more complex terms and stuff like that.
I just had a question. It's not on your rubric, but how would you, I guess one of the things that struck me is that it's abstract. So like when, like it's not something that you can just like point to and be like, this is, like when the content is also one that's like not about physical things, it's like about ideas. And like that makes it just harder because it's like, I don't know, it's like you can't point to a picture and be like, this is what this means because they're again, the ideas are more abstract, so I don't know. I don't know if I, in my head, put it that it make it harder with linguistic complexity, but it's not really linguistic complexity. I don't know where, like...
So, like, I think that would be, part of it would be like the word or phrasing, and I think that at that level, if it's something that is a complex idea that you physically can't imagine, then it becomes, I feel like it becomes abstract because it's not something that is generally, it's in that level, like an EL1 student and an EL2 student, we're using very common language that is going to be the same in every content area. And that they're going to be able to process because it has almost, it has the same meaning in every content area. And so when you start getting into these more complex ideas that you necessarily can't point to and say, this is what this means, this is a visual image of this, then that's really like at a level 5 or 6. And we call it like a level 6 is reaching. So these, I created 2 rubrics that were for reading and listening, which was processing language, and I summarized them to, well actually I took the one rubric and I summarized it to smaller phrases, just to make it something that I could easily use as opposed to like having a bunch of different boxes. I also had a different rubric which was for speaking and writing, so how we ask students, or the type of language that we ask students to produce for us, and then, but that's would be something else that we could explore later if you guys are interested. But so what I did with this is that the teacher that I was, the teacher that I was speaking to agreed that her reading, this particular reading, was falling within a 4 and 5. But this is for a freshman EL class, which means that many of the students in this class are newcomers, so they are at a level 1 or 2. So the reading overall would be very overwhelming, and I understand that the content is very important, so we don't want to take content away, and I have chosen to use history and science because I think that those are language heavy. More often, the language is a lot heavier and it's a lot more specific than a math class, for example. I could get away with more. So that's why I've chosen to do these and explore ideas as a NEL coordinator on how I could support you through this. So when I'm looking at this, and Ms. Lackey is going to give you an example, I don't have time to talk about this, at least you have an example of how I approach this reading. So when I'm looking at this, and when I was looking at the history example and I was looking at the science example, I started by looking at, well, who is this reading most appropriate for? And the teacher that this reading was for, and I agreed that the reading was most appropriate for level 4 and 5, or a level 6, which would be students that are basically can read at a grade level of 9th grade. Once we did that, then we acknowledge and we were able to see that this reading is not appropriate for a large number of our students because our students are freshmen. They're at a level, many of them are at level 1, 2, or they're even at an ESL level 3. So as we're looking at that, we're also acknowledging or we're observing what are the obstacles that struggling readers will face when they're looking at this reading or when they're trying to make meaning of this reading. And then finally, once we acknowledge or we identify what those obstacles are going to be, what language we have to break down, what we have to make more specific, then we can actually create more intentional modifications or accommodations. So how do we address these obstacles directly to make the content more accessible for a larger group of our students? Because this was a science reading and I didn't want to take anything away from the content that the teacher had put in that reading, I just created accommodations for this reading. I didn't do any modifications, which means that I didn't take any of the content away. I just accommodated the way that it was presented to the students by bolding specific sentences, by creating a column where as the teacher said that her intention was to read with students, by creating a column where as a class they would be able to define the important keywords, they would be able to summarize ideas, and then what I did on the side in the column, this was directly related to the questions that the teacher was planning to use with the students. Thank you.